There's a lot of buildings that need to become churches again. Like, they got the steeple, they got the pews, they got the baptistry, but they're not a functioning church.
This is the Church Growth Nation podcast.
So you're at a spot naturally, this is basically a church plant. I mean, yes, technically I have some people that come and sleep on Sundays, but technically this is a church plant. And so what did you do? Did you rebrand? Did you go through something like ARC or CMN? Did you just do it on your own? What was your process?
I did not know about ARC until after we had replanted it. That would have been wildly helpful. ARC has been a great connection and resource for us relationally and for our church. But I want to tell you, I came from a closed off background. It really was closed off. And so we didn't have a lot of the relationships we had today. So I knew that we needed to relaunch a church. And, I was sitting at a conference listening to a guy who pastors a very large church. He inherited it, and he talked about, the church was large, it was going, so he just kind of steered the ship slightly in a different direction. And I remember sitting there thinking, I inherited a ship that sunk. It's at the bottom of the sea. I got to blow this thing up. And that's when I talk through relaunch and transition. That's always, if the church is growing and it just needs to change direction, do that gently. If the church is stalled out, then you gotta overhaul all of the systems and inner workings. If the church has died, then you got to blow it up and you got to start all over again. So we decided that we needed to do a true replant, which was to close the old church down and start out of the building. And I had a name, I had Coast Life, and I had a vision. I knew what I wanted the church to look like and what I wanted it to be like, but I had no idea what to do beyond that. And so I had a friend that had some experience and called him and had him come in. And there's a miracle story that happened there. But one of the things we landed on was Nehemiah. And, Nehemiah was the first one to do a relaunch. He relaunched the city of Jerusalem. And so we just ran Nehemiah's playbook on how to do a relaunch. And, Nehemiah led with a negative vision first. He didn't lead with a positive vision. He went around and surveyed what was wrong with Jerusalem because people had become so accustomed to living in the dysfunction that it no longer bothered them. And so he went around and surveyed the broken down walls and then confronted the people with what he saw. And that was, there was only a handful of people, but that was what we did. Like, I went and just started gathering all of the negative stuff that I could gather. Like, no one had been baptized, and if I remember right, it was like 3 years. No one had been saved. The church had turned off the water heater because it couldn't afford to run the water heater. And so that was something I latched onto. Like, this is God's house. God, who owns cattle on 1,000 hills, he can't afford to run the water heater at his house. Something's wrong. Something's desperately wrong here. And, Nehemiah's words in Nehemiah, I think it's chapter 2, said, let's end this disgrace. Like, we need to put a stop to this. Like, this is not the way it should be. A church should be reaching people. People should be getting baptized. People should be getting saved. There should be provision in God's house. It's his house. There should be provision. And so we led with a negative vision first as we were preparing to take the journey to shut the church down and have a relaunch as Coast Life Church.
What was some of the feelings that you had when you were embracing the fact that you're a church planter and you had not inherited a church? Was that exciting and a positive, like a light at the end of the tunnel, or was that, this is not what I signed up for?
I knew what I was stepping into. I had some benefits that church planners don't have. Is I did have a building, and to the church's credit, even though there was 12 people, in their heyday, there'd been 40 or 50 people, so they had paid off the building and been faithful. And so, when I talk to our story to people, I always like to honor those that faithfully served without being recognized. They were just a small church who was faithful and they paid off their building, and so they couldn't afford to just operate, like paying church insurance, the electric bill, all that stuff. There wasn't enough income to really keep up with all of that stuff. But I did get a building, and so it was dated. It was not an ideal situation, but I did have something to work with. And so what I realized was that I inherited a church that legalism had choked the life out of it. Tradition and legalism had choked the life out of it. And my decision was that I was going to give Jesus his church back. And I just remember having a prayer moment, there was a couple of miracles. And one of these was a moment where we just prevailed in prayer. And I remember praying in the old auditorium. We've built a new building since then, but it was an old traditional church, wooden benches, the American flag on one side, the Christian flag on the other side, the cross with the crown of thorns and the purple garment draped over the cross. And I just remember walking around that auditorium, and I told God this. I said, this church has died, but you took Adam, and he was just a lump of clay, mud, dirt, however you want to describe it. And you breathed into his nostrils. He became both a living being and a life-giving being. And this church has died, and I need you to breathe the breath of life into it. And I've never prayed a prayer where I just knew that something shifted in the heavens. And man, that night, something shifted. God breathed on it. And I think whether it's a replant or a plant, God has to breathe in order for it to become living and have a life-giving essence to it. And it's the same process. We're dead in our sins, and by faith, through God's grace, he breathes on us and we come alive. And just my message to churches is, it doesn't matter how dead it feels. If God can breathe on us and we can become born again, churches can become born again just the same way we can become born again. And that's how I describe our church. It's a born again church. God breathed on it a second time, and it came back to life.
You guys, you embraced it. You felt God shift it. Then some practical things. What did you do to start reaching new people and to start making a new name for the church in a community that's known that building for years?
Well, so we did a Band-Aid approach. We ripped it off, it hurt like crazy, but we told the old church that we're shutting it down. Closed it with honor. Something a friend of mine advised me to do. We closed it with celebration and honor. And one of the practical things, I don't know that this is super practical. I'll get to a couple of practical things, but one of the things that I learned from Nehemiah was when he made the decision that he had to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild. The king gave him the keys to his forest so that he'd have all the provision he needed. And so we just made a decision to go all in. I think, for anybody, whatever God's call is, there's some moment where you have to really just make a decision to go all in. And we made that decision even at the expense of, some personal relationships, some major shifts in our life. One Sunday night, I was sitting with a friend in a Starbucks here in our city, and we had made the decision. He had asked me, and he had asked my wife, "Are you guys willing to pay the price? Go have the conversations, go endure all the hardships?" And we're like, "Yeah, we're going to do it." And we're sitting in the Starbucks. We've written the name of the church down. We've written the dates of when we're going to close out the church and when we're going to relaunch the new church. By the way, we closed it one weekend and relaunched the next weekend. Not ideal, but that's what we did. And I had all of these conversations. I was going to retire all of the board members, all the people who held a position. It was going to be face-to-face conversations, but hard conversations. Even with a handful of people, they're still really difficult conversations. We're embracing to pay this price. We're going all in this moment, and we start talking about what Coast Life Church is going to be. And my wife sings, but I was about to retire the piano player who was 88 years old. I think he was maybe 89 at the time. And we're talking about what to do for music, and we're like, man, we were going to play like soundtracks, and I'm like, that's not it. We need live music. But we didn't have any musicians, and while we're sitting in Starbucks at a table right behind us, 4 kids start singing "What Can what can wash away my sin? What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. They were all teenagers and young adults. They had left a traditional church and were looking for a modern church to go to. And what I didn't realize was when we made the decision to go all in, that the King opened up his forest and had all the resources literally sitting 3 feet away from us. And it was a guy who would become our worship leader, and some people, they were just goofing around teaching a girl how to sing harmony, and just being kids in a Starbucks teaching a girl how to sing harmony, and had no idea that one table over we were talking about replanting a church and what to do for worship. And God in his providence had already released the resources that we need. And like, still to this day, I'd love to think that people come to Coast Life because of my preaching, but I really think it's because of the worship environment that's so prevalent and strong in our church, because God just released it. And nothing happens if you're a church planner. I always tell church planners, nothing's going to happen until you get to your city. Like, you can pray for God to send money and people before you get there, but there's just something about when you make the decision to cross the line of faith, to go to where God called you to do, pay the price you got to pay. It's incredible to watch God's provision. And then on the practical side, we went to work on our facilities. We built our church by selling everything that was in the church on Craigslist, and we sold the church van, we sold the lawnmower. I had a friend who gave me an offering. We relaunched at the worst time you could ever relaunch. We relaunched in June of 2010. If you want to know the worst time of year to relaunch a church, it would be June. Never do June. But it had God breathed on it. It had life even in June. And we started seeing some new people and some people bringing friends. And the big thing that really gave us exposure was we did it for several years. We don't do it anymore, but we did a big back to school event. We're in Florida, so we called it Endless Summer because summer never ends here. And so it was a big water day, water slides. We gave away backpacks, school supplies. I think the first time we did it, a couple of hundred people showed up for the event, and gave us some exposure. That weekend was the first weekend that we broke 40 people. Come on, somebody, breaking that 40 barrier in Jesus' name. And I think by the end of the year, we were right around 70 people. And then all I know is God breathed on it, and just year after year. That's a
lot, though. I mean, that's a big increase. I mean, 3 people to 70 people. That's a miracle.
I'm available for church growth seminars, man, from 3 to 70. We can teach about that all day long.
Let me ask you, at what like number point, I know you have faith, but did you emotionally feel like, oh, this is going to work? Like, how many people did it finally take before you were like, okay?
I don't know. I'm not sure I'm there yet. No, I would say when we started to hit into, I inherited a really small building, so this is going to sound crazy, but for us to run a little over, this is before we built the auditorium that we're in now, but for us to run, we were running just over 400, and for us to do that, we had to have 4 services on the weekend, because we could only fit about 100 people. We've defied every statistic. Like, I know it's a God thing, because if you look at any church growth, church planning information and wisdom, they tell you, don't plan in a small environment. Have more than 100 when you launch. Churches that launch with more than 100 typically keep growing. If you get 100 in your first year, there's just all of these statistics, and somehow by the grace of God, we've defied every statistic says we should not have made it, and by God's grace, we've made it. But when we got around 300 or 400, I realized, when I don't know why, like, maybe this wasn't the right thing to do, but the number that I latched on was, I just believed that we could reach 1,000 people. And there was a day when we were running 400 to 500, and I knew that 1,000 was well within reach of us. And it was actually a day where I don't know, I was just struggling with anxiety and depression. And I was driving home, beating myself up because of a joke that I'd made in my message that was, I don't know if it was inappropriate or it just didn't land. I don't remember, but was just beating myself up. And God spoke to me in a red light while I was going home and said, the church is going to make it, but you're not if you don't get off the emotional roller coaster. You've got to stop living for the highs and the lows and just start enjoying the journey that I have you on. And it really, honestly, that word from God really shifted something in my life where, I watch the numbers like any pastor does, but I'm no longer living for the highs of my own personal performance and all of that stuff. It's just a great season. I love the team that we have. I love the church that God has us on. And so that was a season where I knew the church was going to make it, but it was also the season where I had to learn to enjoy the journey that God had us on and not live for those roller coaster moments.
How many people do you guys run on the weekends now?
So our average is about 850. Like for Easter, we were about 1,900 on our Easter weekend. And so, like when you average it out, a typical weekend there'd be about 800 to 850 people here, and then it averages a little higher than that when you throw in some of the big holidays and all of that stuff.
It's easy on this side of things to look back and see that God was in it and see that everything was going to be okay. But what about the guy who has a church right now of 120 and God's put the same vision that he's put in your heart, but he's worried and he is looking for some inspiration or encouragement or ideas? What would you say to that guy who's in the middle of it, who maybe is going to have a story in 5 years looking back and seeing it, but they are right now at the worst place? How do you get through that?
That one is God plants people. So just knowing that God's planted you in that community, and if he planted you there, it's because you're supposed to thrive and flourish there. So one is just having the confidence to know that that a lack of growth isn't on God's side, it's on our side. Like, I think so many people buy into this idea that we need God to it's not God's will for something to grow. And I can't imagine that it's not God's will to reach people, to see people saved, their names written in the Lamb's Book of Life, to see somebody who was on their way to hell get their destination changed and go to heaven. So let's just settle there that God planted you there, and it's God's will for your church to grow. Like, I think that's something that every not just church leaders, I think that's something every church member should shift in their heart, that growth is not optional, and it's never on God, but a lack of growth is never on God's side, it's on our side. And that is that there's some decisions that need to be made, and that's where I'd love to put a positive spin on it. But somebody told me a long time ago that church growth is based on how much pain you can endure. And I believe that with all of my heart. I think one of the reasons we get stagnant and stale is we get tired of making hard decisions that are going to cost us personal pain. And so we settle for a lack of growth because it puts us in a place where we don't have to pay the price that we want to pay. And all I would say is there's growth in your future, but there's also pain in your future. And you got to pick your pain. And you either got to pick the pain of not living up to the potential and the things that God has for you, or you got to pick the pain of making the hard decisions, of doing the things that God's called you to do, taking the risk, walking by faith, making the bold decisions, whether it's the rename of the church that nobody wants to get rid of the old name, or it's removing the leader who's no longer effective, but they're related to you, or there's strong relationship ties. I could go down the list, but it always comes down to those things, that there's decisions that we don't want to pay the price of losing the biggest giver, or we don't want to pay the price of having the hard conversation. And it's not on God's side. God's got all of the growth. He's got all the provision. He wants to provide the power, the same power that raised Christ from the dead. It's the same power that's still available for his church today. It just really takes us removing the things out that allows God to breathe on it so that it can live again.
I love that in every way. And so practically, you want to get over 1,000. You're a couple hundred people away from that. What are some practical, are you just going to wait and let God do it? Or do you take action on your part with strategies and events and social media or anything like that?
Yeah, for us, the season that we're in is I really do love where our church is at. And so the battle for us today is not to get complacent with where we are. And, we've experienced a lot of blessings. We were able to build a new facility. It's a great facility, beautiful room. And, we got great property and a lot of great things going. And, the tendency is to stop taking risk and to stop paying the price and get comfortable. And so for us, for 1,000, it really comes down to three things, and that is staff, systems, and structure. And those are the things that we're working on right now, is getting the right people. It's challenging because what worked and the capability of leadership at 300 or 400 is drastically different than it is today. And so walking through getting the right staff and the right seats is much more complicated than really I imagine. We've hit 1,000 and kind of backed up a little bit because we realized that the system that we had in place just wasn't in a place to sustain it. Man, we've been all around it, and so to move beyond it, it came down to systems for us. So we're in a process of just tightening up all of our system, and then even our structure. Like we've restructured even the government of our church this year, just to make sure that it's as healthy and strong. That there's nothing within our structure that would prevent us from being the church that God wants us to be.
That's awesome. That's awesome. If there's people out there that want to reach out to you, want to connect with you, have a personal question, they maybe need some advice, how can they get a hold of you?
Well, I'm going to give them your cell phone number, and you can just relay to. I think the good old fashioned email. It's Jason W. is my email. Jason W. at mycoastlifechurch.com. One of the things I really love, one is I love church planners. I love talking to church planners. And then I was talking to somebody this week at a conference about our journey, and I'm passionate about seeing churches that maybe need to replant or relaunch, or maybe just take a major transition. And my line I use on that is that there's a lot of buildings that need to become churches again. Like they got the steeple, they got the pews, they got the baptistry, but they're not a functioning church. Nobody's getting saved. There's no God moments going on. There's no baptisms. Like those are kingdom resources that need to be turned into vibrant, thriving churches. Because the building isn't a church, right? It's the people, it's the God encounters, it's the salvation, it's Jesus showing up. And so that's what I'm passionate about. And so would love to connect. It's Jason W. at mycoastlifechurch.com. Our website is mycoastlifechurch.com. I'm on all the social media platforms. Jason L. Warman would love to connect.
And this is, the Church Growth Nation podcast. There's a Facebook group, and it's really just for pastors looking for everybody to connect, articles. And I'm going to reach out to you, Jason, and see if we can get you to write maybe an article with some tips for church planters, and people can comment and share. So, I encourage you guys that are watching or listening to join the Facebook groups, join in the conversation. And Jason, we appreciate you. I know you're a busy guy. You're personally out there building the new sanctuary. Just had to take a break.
I got to get back to the drill.
I got you, dude. We appreciate you, man, very much. And I think that your story and just the hearing of the raw, this is how it is at the very beginning, but trust and lean in on God, and in an instant, in one prayer, you can feel the shift happen that's coming for some people, and stay the course, fall in love with the journey and not just the end result. Fall in love with being faithful every day, and remember that our reward is in eternity. It's not at some day when you've made it here on earth. It's just in being faithful is the joy. And so I think that people will glean from that. And so
thank you so much for having me on, man. I've loved our time together.
Yeah. All right. Well, go Razorbacks then, huh?
All right. Pick Suey.
All right. Blessings, man. Thank you very much.
All right.